Okay. Everybody ready? We're missing Jim and Rob, that's right. Okay, I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is a regular meeting for the Board of Finance for Thursday, April 4th, 2019. This is a continuation of our budget review process. So we have a few budget items to cover and a couple other things. Given some of the folks that we have here, what I think I'm going to do is cover some other business, which is not listed on here. So we just want to talk about Channel 79 and some Treasury stuff. So we're going to do those first, since we have some of those folks with us tonight. So I need a motion to do other business, correct?
Actually, they're related to the budget, so they can be covered under.
They can be covered. Okay. So first thing I would like to do, Mike, there you are, Mike. And Mike, by the way, see my timer here? I'm keeping meeting timings for you.
Thank you for doing that. That helps a lot.
No, so Mike is here to represent Channel 79, and this pertains to a capital request that they have made, and I just wanted to have him come in and present an overview. That has to do with room 119 downstairs, correct?
Yeah, I'm Mike Wheeler, Chairman of the Board of Advisors, filling in for Jim Cameron and Dave Beaver, who couldn't be here tonight. We are in phase 3. You believe that Darien TV 79 went on the air the same year as the iPhone came out. So we're moving into, we just, through the generosity of the Darien Foundation and Area 9 funds, we were able to finally replace the cameras in this room and in the auditorium. Literally, the cameras that we had, there were no replacement parts. And we also built out room 119 so we could produce more efficiently out of there. Now we're moving into the next phase, and the money that we're asked for tonight is for partial funding of being able to go live out of room 119. There are increasingly more important meetings out of that room simultaneously with meetings that are in this room. And so it will also, with the fiber that we're going to run, will also give us the access when the demand exists to be able to go live out of the Mather Center. If there were some meeting there, we would just have to do another 100-yard drop at the end. But this is the hard part. We had a rough estimate of about $2,500 to do it. The estimates are coming in double and triple that. So we have access to other funds through Area 9 that we get a distribution. But those dollars are diminishing as more people cut the cord. So we're here to ask for the restoration of our capital budget request of $2,700. Last year, all of our capital costs were picked up by the graciousness of the Darien Foundation and through our Area 9 grant.
Okay. So, I'm sorry, so you'd said there was estimates of $2,500 to actually...
That was the estimate that Ed estimated, but he was looking at using Cap 5, and we need to do fiber. And so the estimates, we've gotten 2 estimates so far, and we're getting a third.
Got it. And the $2,700 covers all of that?
No,
or that's just to restore the amount that goes into the account?
That would cover part of it.
Part of it. And the rest of you actually have the funding for the rest of it?
Well, Area 9, we get Area 9 dollars that 60% of which we can use for capital. And so we use some of the Area 9 dollars, and that should be enough to cover it.
Okay. Any questions?
And how much do you get from Area 9?
At the high point, before people start, the way the $5 a month works is it's only for people who are paying for a video service. And so as people downgrade their video service and just do over the top and have broadband, public access doesn't benefit from those dollars at all. So as the number of Altice subscribers and Frontier subscribers decline, the amount that we get decline. That money is divided by 9 towns. We used to get more because Stanford never asked for any money because they didn't have any government access television. Now they do, so the pot, there's another town in the pot that gets their share of it. Half of it goes to government access, half of it goes to education. And TV 78 has really made terrific changes in the last 3 months, and we understand the Board of Education meetings are going to start going live on TV 78 in a couple of weeks.
I'm sure everyone's thrilled by that. What's the timing on this work? When did you plan to do
It would be over the summer.
Over the summer, okay.
John, I just have a question. I'm just curious. If a house were to cut the cord, as is happening increasingly, how do they access Channel 79?
The Vimeo over the top
So it's
is,
streaming.
it's streaming. It's still on Vimeo, and the access on Vimeo on a big screen is excellent.
Yeah.
So-
And you have a whole library there.
So a couple things about this. One of the things that we like to do for all of this funding in terms of sequencing is to have them go to the respective sort of primary boards, excuse me, the primary boards, if you will, and then it comes to the Board of Finance, and then we have an appropriation process through the RTM. In this particular case, given the timing that you have for this, in other words, the work's not going to be done right away, my sense, and talking to the town about this, is the better way to handle this is actually to go back to the Board of Selectmen, since they are really the originators for town-related operating and capital spending. And in this case, since it's a relatively small amount of money, let's just get a transfer put through.
Okay.
And that'll be faster, actually just as fast as us doing something here, because the reality is even though we vote on this budget's not going to get approved by the RTM until May. Conceivably, you could go to the next Board of Selectmen meeting, get a transfer request, that could come to this board, and we just appropriate it through that process. So what you do is, I think the case is compelling. Obviously, let the Board of Selectmen decide. I think they'll find it as well. We'll see.
Yeah, this is just our second year, I think, that TV 79 has been part of the budget process, and Jim comes now to the quarterly department heads meeting.
Terrific.
This is only the second year, so
Right.
good, that's what we'll do.
Yes, I'd recommend go through that process. We'll get the transfer order here, which should be easy since we've already heard this presentation, and we'll handle it in a regular order like that. But again, assuming everybody agrees, why it should be
Good,
pretty
I'm actually
straightforward.
on their agenda Monday night for revising our guidelines after 10 years, so
Add this as topic number 2.
I'll bring it up then.
Okay.
Good, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Mike, I appreciate that. Okay, so what I'd like to do next is have just a brief discussion about the interest income budget for the next fiscal year. So the interest income is determined, that budget is determined by, and actually all of our investments are managed by the town's treasurer, Joan Hendrickson. Joan is here tonight, we'll hear from her briefly, but she is in a unique spot, I guess, in the sense that she is not just in charge of a Treasury Department, but is an at-large elected official like all of us, and has the fiduciary responsibility for managing the fund, the town's cash reserves and investing them according to state statutes and requirements. So what she does every year is project a budget for interest income, which then shows up into the town budget that we review. And a great thing about Darien is that all kinds of people get together and take a look at things, and you've got lots of smart eyes on all kinds of topics. And I think a good result of that is it always helps us get to a better answer than just one person looking at things. So I certainly always encourage all that. F&B has been taking a look at this interest income budget for this coming year, but they've also been looking at some of the investment policies and procedures that surround all of that, which, again, taking a fresh look at that is always a good thing to do. And they have come up with some recommendations that they would like us to consider, since any change in what's proposed in terms of revenue throughout the town budget, but in this instance in particular, is the purview of this board and goes no further from there. So we have here this evening Joan, who's our treasurer, and I actually wouldn't mind hearing from you. It's been a while since you've spoken to the Board of Finance, and maybe just a quick overview of what you're doing I think would be good. And then Jack maybe can say a few words about their proposal. What I don't want to do is get into an extended discussion about this. Some of this material's just been presented to us, and we've not had a chance to read it, so we're not making any decisions tonight. But I just want to give everyone a chance to acknowledge their roles in this process, and we'll give it due consideration. So, Joan, if you'd like to give just actually for even the viewers, since it's not a chance that you get to do that, just provide a little bit of an overview of your important role and a little bit about your budgeting process, and then
Okay.
we'll hear a few words from Jack and be done.
I'm a big believer in handouts, so I'm going to give you handouts to look at. This is the memo that I've talked about. I would ask also that this not be shared beyond the Board of Finance, because some of this is competitive information.
Understood?
And
Is
I
this the
will,
same thing, John?
yes, they're all the same thing. And actually, can I take one of those?
I mean, yeah. Diane,
Okay.
Frank, would you give me one of those? Yeah, thank you.
There should be plenty there for you, Jamie.
Oh, Great.
Okay. For the viewers, and for those of you, I know some of you very, very well on the Board of Finance, and others of you I don't know at all. So with that in mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit of who I am very briefly. My name is Joan Dunn Hendrickson. I'm the elected treasurer for Darien. I have been your treasurer since 2005. In my experience, I have spent, as I said, since 2005 as the treasurer. Before that, I also spent 12 years on the RTM. So I'm very familiar with the RTM's processes and procedures, having been a member for quite some time. What I have given you was a memo. It was addressed to Taylor because I watched the Vimeo of the F&B meeting in which Taylor was asked to follow up with me. And so the memo was addressed to her. There was no intention to slight anybody. It was just that's who I was given as the source. So hopefully you have all seen the information that I have given to you. The graph that you have is a historical Fed funds rate. There's nothing more than to illustrate, how low can you go? And this is pretty low. That's what our environment has been like for most of my term, which is, again, very, very challenging. There are a couple of issues that seem to be coming up over and over again, and partially it is our projection numbers and our cash flows. And again, Jen, you can correct me if I misstep, but there is an implication that our cash flows are even. They are not even. They vary from month to month. The largest one variation that I'm aware of, and my memo has one mistake in it, besides a couple typos. When I wrote it, the last time I had looked at our balloon payment for the Board of Education, it was $2 million. It is, in fact, now $3 million. So the month of June, you will see probably an outflow of close to $5 million. That is unlike other months. So the idea that we have this consistent cash flow is incorrect. And I just want to state that up front. In terms of budgeting, if you are all available or have access to Munis, for those of you who don't, I can go over what we've done. If you look at the last page of your memo that I handed you is investment income. This is investment income, everything we have earned since 1986. You can see in 2008, the number was $295,000 for the general fund. Total town funds, as you know, includes other things other than investment income. But this is a history since 1986 of every nickel we've earned. In terms of our Munis projections, because, as I said, if you look at those rates against your Fed funds chart, which again, they are not totally comparable. I don't want to even allude to the fact that they're comparable, but there is a connection. We have raised our budget every year, year over year, for the last at least 3 years. The budget in 2017 was $100,000. In 2018, it was $125,000. In 2019, it was $175,000. I have gone over the budget for every year, I believe, except for one, which was in the heart of the recession. But I do want to stress that there is, one of the things I pointed out in my memo, there is no problem with going over budget and returning more money to this town. There is a big problem with coming in and saying I'm making a promise to you as a fiduciary with my own integrity on the line, saying that I am going to make this money for you. There's a big problem because ultimately it will flow through to the fund balance. And for those of you who are experts on fund balance, that is the one thing that is uppermost towards our bond rating. And we bonded 2 weeks ago? Last week. 2 weeks ago. I signed documents last week. And that was a subject of discussion, even in our bonding, is how important that fund balance is. So anything that, even a small number that takes away from that fund balance is a negative for Darien. So that is something I never want to be able to do. And so far, I have not done that. One other question that keeps coming up is, what is a benchmark rate? Now, I have given to you, and this is where as I said, this is competitive info. I have brokers who send me things. This is one broker who happens to be, well-versed and trustworthy, and you can see what their rates are for 3 months, 9 months, 12 months. And the issue seems to be, there seems to be a very, I don't know what the term is I could use, elaborate view of what STIF is and how good they are. So I'd like to give you just a very brief history of STIF and our relationship with STIF. STIF's history I would describe as colorful. Other people might describe it a whole lot worse than that. In 2003, the treasurer of the state of Connecticut, who was also the head of STIF, went to jail. And he went to jail for, and I could quote you, but basically, let's see, he was accused of diverting state pension and trust business to specific investment firms in return for kickbacks. And again, this is the head of STIF. Okay, 2007, and I'm not trying to do Democrat or Republican. He was Republican. The next one who came up is a Democrat. In 2007, there was a default in STIF. For those of us who have been trained, as I have over the last 45 years of my continuous financial career, my specialty is credit risk management. That went bing, bing, bing in my brain right away. Because a short-term investment should never default. It is just unheard of for that. It was what was happening with the state, and the state was rated AAA at the time. It had a $52 million reserve, but it was 2007, and we can point to a lot of banks and funds that went under with AAA ratings, with significant reserves and credit default swaps put on the other end of them. And again, we all know that story. I don't need to go into that. But when I called them, I said, it was my warning bell went off in my brain, and I called the assistant treasurer of STIF, and I said, what's going on? What's happening here, guys? And he said, well, we had an investment for a British bank, merchant banking firm that went under, and it's going to cost us. We don't know how much it will cost us. So again, being the old credit hand that I am, I said, how much more of this stuff do you have in the portfolio? We went through investment by investment to the tune that there were 40 million in CDOs and SIVs similar to the one that just went broke, okay? Out of a $52 million reserve, okay? The AAA rating was based on that $52 million reserve. So, there's an old adage in life that it's better to be lucky than smart. STIF was lucky that the rest of them didn't go. They could easily have gone. They were structured exactly the same way as CDOs and SIVs. At that point, the person sitting in John's chair was Murray Stegelman. I went to Yvonne Klein, our first selectman, and Murray Stegelman. I said, hey, this is what's happening. I am very uncomfortable with this. We had $27 million sitting in STIF. STIF was a vehicle that every treasurer in the state parked money in. And the chairman of the Board of Finance said, I want our money out of there. And I said, me too. And Yvonne agreed. And it got to the point that it was almost, I hesitate to use this word, comical, because Murray is head of a hedge fund, and he goes to India, and he was calling me from Bangalore half the time saying, Joan, have we moved the money? Joan, have we moved the money? For those of you who are fund managers and risk managers, you can't move $27 million in a day. You do it over a period of time so you don't upset the asset liability position of the organization, because you can get sued if that happens. We didn't want that to happen. So every day I moved money. At the end of the period, I got a call from the state saying, Mrs. Hendrickson, we noticed you've moved $27 million out of STIF. Is this ordinary course of business? And I said, no, it's not. I said, you are not managing the money well. The kicker of the comment was, to me, is I'm one of those people who digs. So I talked to the CFA in charge of STIF, and I said, how did you make this investment? What were you thinking? And she said, well, we can't go through all of our investments. It hits our criteria, and then we do it. And I said, wait a minute. You're a CFA, you're a charter holder, and you're telling me you're not looking at individual investments that you make. So if there was ever any, verification of our opinion, it was the fact that they told me they really didn't review every investment that they made, that they just met their criteria. And again, I don't have to repeat what's happened to you in 2007 with the very same, premise of AAA reserve for asset-backed securities with credit default swaps on some, usually on some of them. This is a familiar story to those of us who lived through it. Rates crashed, and it was a very, very difficult time. But this board was integrally involved in the decision to get out of STIF and stay out of STIF.
Was this board also involved in developing the investment policy, or is that something
The
you did,
investment
or is
policy,
that your exclusive
I will
purview?
tell you how it was done, because I came into office and we had been written up by our audit team because we didn't have an investment policy from the previous treasurer. So Kate Bush said to me, Joan, they're coming back in about 2 months and you need to write an investment policy. And I said, great, have any samples? And so she took one. And I wrote an investment policy, which I presented to the Board of Finance, I presented to the auditors, I presented to Kate. It is actually my intention this summer, because it is an older policy, to redo it this summer, to update it. I have done, what do we call them in wills, Frank? Codicils, where you add on to a policy. I have done a few of those along the way, but it was in accordance with the government, and again, Kate, GFA, thank you. I was calling you Kate, it's Jen. GFA policies and their standard for an investment policy. So it was written by me, and again, it's supposed to be written by me.
Right.
But the auditors need to make sure that we have one. We do indeed have one.
So you're proposing a fresh look at all that this
I am. And again, that's one of my summer projects.
Okay.
To look at, because it has been a while.
Would that
since I've
come to
done it.
this board for discussion, presentation, or approval?
We
or is
can
it
do
your
whatever you'd like.
Or is it your exclusive purview to do that?
It is my exclusive purview, but I'm happy to discuss it with anybody.
Okay.
Okay, because it only makes sense to discuss it as much as possible.
Okay.
But I do, as I said, there seems to be an enamorment with STIF. And again, I took my direction from this board to get us out of STIF. Now, we still have money in STIF up to, I believe, sometimes up to $100,000. Okay, and I'll tell you exactly what's in there, which our clean air and water payments are done from there. Our ECS and ECR money come into there, and our Mashantucket grants come into there. And what we usually do is keep enough to make sure we've covered the clean air, clean water, and then we take it all out and put it in another bank.
So I think where we are is there's kind of two separate issues here. One of them is a very short-term issue, which is the amount that's budgeted for interest income in this budget. The second is the longer-term issue around the policy and the strategies of your office in terms of how you deploy and invest things. And so I think I would say as to that second piece, that ball is clearly in your court, and if you'd like to collaborate with us and obviously others to think about that, and if there's some way that we can be helpful, I think that's a good idea to take a fresh look at that. The Board of Finance has been taking a fresh look at its own policies over the last year, and fresh is good. So
Okay.
I think that's a good idea.
Again, that was always the plan, even
Right.
before this meeting.
Okay.
That was a summer project because it's something where I have some time to do it.
Right. I think in terms of the interest income budget, I know there's some controversy around that because of the run rate that we're seeing over the last year in terms of the amount of interest income that's accumulating versus your planned budget for next year. What I think we'd rather do is not get into a discussion about that simply because members of this board have not had a chance to read in detail the proposals from F&B, Jack and Bert, and their thinking. I've not had a chance to go through all that in detail, and there's been some updates to all of that. So what I'd like to do is propose the following, unless, Jack, you have a felt need, or Bert, to say something.
I actually would like to.
Okay, we'll do that.
I'd like to actually finish up something
Okay,
else.
please go
if I
ahead.
could.
Yep.
Okay, I can tell you exactly what we have as of today,
Okay.
which is $351,723. That is for 8 months in Stiff. I mean, in Munis, rather. Okay, we haven't gotten our March statements yet, but again, the way our budget works, it's a declining flow because we get our most money in January and in July, and then we live off of that money. And again, that's why it makes the June balloon payment so problematical, is because that's at the low point of our cash flow. And again, cash flow is Jen's domain, not mine, but I will tell you, even in our investing now, what I used to be able to do is take the fund balance, which is now about 20 million, and invest half of it in term facilities. We are not doing that now because we don't know what's going to happen. I have about a third of it invested in CDs or some sort of term facility because we don't know what we're going to need. We really don't.
Okay.
In terms of the investment income, as I said, the budget amount has almost doubled over last year. Okay? I'm $50,000 over what I budgeted for next year with 4 months left of declining income.
Okay.
So the idea of that I'm going to earn this massive amount of money, I think I will earn some money this year. I've been able to put together some good deals. I do want to talk about, again, very briefly, I've had this say, Joan, Fed funds are up, you must be doing great. And I said, it has nothing to do with what I do. Because each bank's funding ability depends on their own need. I will use the story of our largest bank. Till 5 months ago, they were giving us 16 basis points because they're a Basel III bank, which means they have to put up 100% collateral and 100% reserves. Many of our large money center banks have gotten out of the government finance business for that reason. There are a lot of restrictions on there. So we make deals based on, the funding opportunities that we have. And I will tell you, as many people know, I'm very aggressive in saying, hey guys, time for us to look at this rate again, and it seems awfully low, and I've got this much money to put out, let's see what you can do. Why don't you come back to me with what your best rate is? I'm very aggressive about going after rates, but again, we have to understand it is dependent on the funding need of each bank.
Right.
Any of you who have gone out and done individual CDs, there's a sweet spot on every rate sheet. That's where that bank needs money.
Right.
Okay, so I just wanted to clear that up before we finish.
That's helpful. Before Joan steps down, does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I'd be happy to answer
Just
questions.
a comment. I read your report with avidity. It was more than thorough. In fact, it was quite thorough. The comments on Stiff, Joan, are quite an indictment. I was around when Stiff was created.
I knew you were.
I was in the state senate at
Right.
that time. There's a reason Stiff is there, because we don't all have Joan Hendrickson, all 169 towns. But I object to those comments about Stiff.
Okay,
Too strong. That we had a state treasurer in a peccadillo who was indicted and served time is history, a very bad history. But it's almost a specious comment when you're indicting Stiff from something that happened that's almost irrelevant. And so, just let me finish. I'm not defending Stiff, but, and your independent judgment with Murray is exemplary. There was clearly something that you had, with your own experience, determined. But I wouldn't just dismiss Stiff. And I'm not here, and I'm not enamored with Stiff. I don't use Stiff for anything, but I just be mindful that it's a state facility run by professionals that are trying to do a job with economies of scale statewide. And I just think those comments are they're not appropriate at this time. And if you choose not to use Stiff, that's your choice. But the indictment was a little too strong.
well, again, Jamie, we can agree to disagree. It's history. It happened. It happened on my watch, some of it happened before my watch. But those are the facts. They happened. And again, it is not an organization, I'm hearing a lot of benchmarking against Stiff. Stiff is not an organization that we choose to use. And what I think bothered me the most is the idea that they did a better job than we in the town of Darien did, which was what was being told to me by F&B, by F&B members.
Okay, let me
It's not the
John,
case.
I know what F&B was saying. That's a different discussion.
Yeah. But it's part of the whole discussion, Jamie. And again, you might find him specious. I'll agree to disagree with you. I understand you served in the state senate with them, and I know you have a long history there. But this order, or I shouldn't say order, but request came from this board, who felt the same way I did. Okay? So it's not just me making those comments. It was very, very clear where this board of finance
So
stood.
there's a plague on the house of stiff forever.
For a while. They haven't proved
I'm
that
just making
they're...
my point. That's
Yeah.
all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've covered this point, but thank you. Other questions for Joan before she steps down? Joan, I appreciate you coming by
Thank
today.
you.
This is very helpful to hear this, and we'll move forward. Jack, if you had some brief comments, and I'm not looking for a rebuttal of all these points.
I'm not rebuttal. No, I can't.
Rebuttal.
Jack Davis, 197 Hoyt Street, since you're going to ask me when I leave. A couple comments I want to make. First of all, a lot of things have been made out of a March 11th meeting. I suggest that people rewatch it, because during that meeting, I clearly stated that Joan did an excellent job in 2007 of removing us based upon the investments in STIF at that time. I have said that in more than one occasion. When we discussed this budget, and throughout that meeting, I tried to separate what is our current earnings based upon the 4 months, I found out it was 4 months, I thought it was 6 initially, in our investment income versus what the budget is. In fact, I said, if we do review of investment policy, that's a summer project. I said that numerous times during that meeting, and I still believe it. I think from our perspective, and from listening to the board, I have 3 things that I would personally, and I believe in conversation with a consensus of my members, might consider the board to consider. Because I understand this is not our purview. We can raise questions, but this is your purview. We do believe, based upon a series of issues, that the current budget revenue is understated. I also believe that the risk of whether or not we go into the general fund sits at this board. I also have seen, by reviewing, because I went back over the last 10 years, I do want to make a comment. Thank you, Kate, because 11 years ago, that budget book was horrible to read, and I stopped. So the revisions they've made life a lot easier. There have been times where, in fact, the Board of Finance has increased revenue, and we didn't make it. There was only one that was over 100,000. Some of them are 20,000 one way or another. And there's no question that the interest rate environment, it's not catastrophic. And what risks, we look for this board to decide, not individual departments. So here's where I'm at. We believe the budgeted income for the investment is low. But we also know, and I've had a conversation with Kate just the other day, that if you look at both our Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen budgets, they really start in the fall. They're based upon certain assumptions, and those assumptions change. They've even changed after both boards have approved. If I was to look at the income side, again, not my purview, but we still look at it, I shouldn't say without question. There is question about whether or not the town clerk revenue is higher in the 20 budget than it should, or whether or not the building revenue is higher, because the original assumption was they were going to put the shovel in the ground in the spring, and that has moved. If this was a corporation and town clerk was a division, I could go to Donna and say, what are you going to do to drive your revenue up? But this is a government. That's not how it works. It's based upon who comes in the door. So if our town clerk revenue it has some modification that needs to be, and our building modification has some to be, the question is, do we not increase the income to where it should be? Estimate may be $700,000 this year. The rate environment is indicating something similar for the next. And then reduce some of our income on the town clerk side and the building side, where we net out someplace about 150, but the buckets are properly reflected to what we know now. The last part is, I do believe in collective, that multiple thoughts are better than one. I'm not an investment. I'm a banker. I know payments, I know settlement really, really well. I know cash management real well. But there are people that if we collectively get together and talk about stiff new policy, our policy is outdated. I believe our treasurer has been partially bound by an outdated policy. It is worthwhile to review, and if we can do that during the summer, similar to what this board has been doing on multiple policies, that would be great. If those three things happened, I'm a happy camper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Comments or questions from anyone? Okay.
What's the impact of a $100,000 change in income, Jack?
If we went to 150, it's 2 basis points on the mill rate. Roughly.
How much would that mean for an individual homeowner?
I honestly haven't calculated, but I do know that we spent about, with no disrespect, we spent 20 minutes discussing a $60,000 item. $150,000 is very rare to find in any of the budgets during the years that I have done budget review. So all I'm saying is it's worth to look at. Last year, the Board of Finance increased the revenue. And so the only thing F&B can ask is for you to look at it, and then we value your opinion.
Well,
Okay.
I calculated it, and it's about $1.50 a month.
Okay.
Okay.
That still matters to some people in this town.
Taylor Carter, 385 Middlesex Road. I just want to clarify, as a member of Finance and Budget, that it was not a unanimous sentiment in the committee. We did not take a vote. I know I don't happen to feel the same way, and I know that one other member does not feel the same way. It is our opinion, at least the two of us who have discussed it since then, that we have a very competent treasurer, and we have we have every reason to be conservative. Like you said, John, there's risk coming at us that is skewed to the downside. I think I'd rather miss in the way she's prepared us to. And that, I forgot what I was going to say other than that, but I think we were both thinking this was not something that we really needed to pursue, and we were confident in her number, and that there was a really statistically significant chance that we could have returns less than some people think we could next year. I mean, there's a lot coming at us that we can't anticipate. That's all.
Okay, thank you. I guess my comments on this was I do, as I said before, welcome multiple eyes taking a look at what we do as a town. I think we always get to better decision-making. Another hallmark of this town, though, is the way we approach these things. So certainly, in the time I've been here, one of the things that I like to see is a longer-term process, a series of iterative discussions, bringing the relevant parties to the table, and having a slow consensus build in terms of what we need to do. So that's not happened this time. Okay, what we've had now is we get to a point where there's significant controversy and difference of opinion mere minutes before we actually pass the budget. So that's sort of contrary to the way I like to see things run, and what I think historically we've done well as a town, which is we work for quite a while, work through these details and issues, bring different folks to the table, both elected officials, professionals, all that, and get to a thoughtful answer that a collective body could look at and say, I'm not sure I could get to a better answer than that. In this case, we've not pursued that process. There have been some discussions back and forth, but clearly at that level, there's not really been agreement as to what to do next. So we don't have to decide this right now, and I don't want to. I don't have enough facts. So what I would like to do, and I'll do that on behalf of this board, anybody who wants to join the conversation, I'd like to have an extended discussion with Jen, but also our Board of Selectmen, Jamie, to get their point of view. Joan, I'd like to talk to you. Jack, I'll talk to you. And then for our meeting next week, try to bring together those perspectives and come up with a point of view as to what we should do. We do have the ability to change the interest income budget as part of this process, but I don't want to do that in a fact-free way, at least from my perspective, because I have not had a chance to study this, and I have not done this consensus building that I just described. I think it's important that we have that. Everybody in this town has individual and discrete responsibilities, and for us to crash through that and change that without actually involving those responsible individuals as part of the process is kind of contrary to the way I think about things. Senator.
And I'm loath to make any more comments because your comments are perfectly correct. So we could do whatever we want with that number. We could say it could be higher, or it could be lower. I want to make that clear. But I think that would really be foolish, and it would be an inappropriate and imprudent decision for the board. We have an exemplary fiduciary. We have a competent treasurer. We have a separation of some of the authorities that are conferred to us as a board to prepare and approve a budget. But I think it is the kind of meddling that can go on in the short term that could affect a fiduciary's judgment that gets people in trouble.
Right.
And so, I actually had a chance to read this late Tuesday night. I read Joan's response to Taylor. It was very well prepared. It covered everything thoroughly. And so there are variables on cash flow. There are variables on taking this to auction with uneven demand, constraints on some of the big banks. It's all beautifully articulated, and you have to commend Joan for preparing that. So I want to make it clear that we could have a judgment. We're welcome to have a judgment about interest rates, but I don't think that's our job here. That's what the fiduciary does, and that should be presented to us. And so I think the way for us to really lead on this, and by the way, not stick our nose in where it doesn't belong, because Joan's welcoming it, that there is a group that sits down. And as we've done before, as Jack articulated, I mean, this is the stuff that I want to do, that we actually think about policy. We think about the appropriateness of what we're doing. We revisit the practice that we might have fallen into as a convention that's not a best practice, and we overlay, whether it's GFOA or other standards for investment policy statement governance best practices, that we bring it to bear. And I think the time is good for that. In the short term, I think it's bordering on reckless for us to question the fiduciary's judgment on the eve of passing the budget.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Frank.
Yeah, well, I don't view this as an all or nothing proposition, and obviously, some way you bring the people together, and the consensus is through compromise. When you have the discussion, some of these discussions, and I'm sure people may want to participate, although it might be better not to, you might want to touch base a little bit on Jack's thoughts about the softness and some of those other numbers.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I would just say that finally that a point of celebration here is that we're starting to have these discussions, right? And I would applaud not just Joan for her work over a long period of time and recently in terms of preparing some of these materials, but Jack and Bert and Taylor and others who've spent time on this, you guys should be applauded as well, because you're raising questions, you're asking, and that's what challenges everybody to try to get to a better answer. So I don't want to diminish that. I think that's fantastic that you've done that. And my point is really about the hallmark of this town, which is that collaborative effort that you take someone who asks, say, I have an irritating question I want to pose, right? And to work through a process to get in front of the relevant people, and make it less irritating, right? I'm in charge of irritation, so anyway. But I think, but I want to applaud everybody for taking the time to think about all this. As I said, I'll try to reach out and see if I can get enough facts to where I could help inform a Board of Finance point of view so that we can come to a decision on all this, since it's ultimately our responsibility. But I'll do that in the coming days and try to be ready for our meeting next week to present that to everyone in a public forum. So thank you all for participating in this discussion. Okay, we've got a few budgets to go through, and I think this will actually be relatively quick. So on our agenda for today is protective services, excluding police, which we have already covered. What I did and what Paul did separately was to pose some questions to Jennifer and to Kate. And so again, this is in replacement of our visits with the fire chiefs, which I kind of missed, because one of the great things about Darien is that you can walk into the Darien Fire Department.
You like the gear.
Well, yeah, I mean, who doesn't like big trucks? I mean, let's be clear. But I remember walking into the Darien Fire Department one day, and this young man points up to a picture right above the door, and he says, "Did you know that is my great-great-grandfather from 1901, right?" And so you look at that and you think, what a great institution to have in a town like Darien, that you could point to something like that and have generational pride, right, from a young man like that. I thought it was terrific. That aside, the few questions that I posed to Jennifer, and this is after having looked at both the operating and the capital budgets for our all the fire departments, the fire marshal, the fire commission, as well as emergency management services. I'll just touch on these briefly. One of the things that they did in their budget was to consolidate medical and testing services. Those previously had been separately managed by the individual fire departments, and as Kate and Jennifer reported, there was a sense that it would be better to centralize those into the fire commission and manage them as a single pool of resources as opposed to separate ones by department. And I think your sense is that we can spend less money on that. It would be better managed.
Yes.
Yeah, so I like that, and I think that makes good sense. Another one was just on wireless communications. You'll know that they cut those out of the individual budgets, and that's been all moved to radio equipment. I'm sorry, where is that now? Is that in the fire commission as well?
I think the question was specifically in Darien Fire Department.
Right.
They consolidated their wireless into their radio.
Got it, okay. And then one of the other interesting things is just the flight officer and the need, I think, to add additional hours to support that person's work. And in the my specific question was what was the situation there, and that the fire marshal's office seems to be under some pressure in terms of the volume of work that they have and whether their staffing levels are adequate. And the response here was that there were more hours requested for the person filling the role for blight officer, and that it was their proposal in terms of the additional hours that they needed. But you mentioned also in the answer that the blight prevention process is under review. Can you add any details to that?
That's Kate's answer.
That's Kate's answer. Okay. Jamie, please, actually.
Good evening, Jamie Stevenson, your first selectman.
Good evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for all of your hard work this week. So, yes, the Blight Review Board has been very busy. What we anticipated being a board that would look at approximately a dozen properties when the ordinance was created has actually had to, in one form or another, through the Blight Review Officer, consider about 50 properties to date. Some of them were easier than others to remedy. Some residents in Darien were exceedingly grateful that we had a mechanism by which we could help folks get some support. We are now down to the hardcore cases, if you will, and they are taking an extraordinary amount of time. They are actually requiring significant engagement on the part of our legal counsel. And we, as we're learning along the way, the RTM wrote a really thoughtful ordinance. But from an operational perspective, there are things that we could do better to move the process along a little bit quicker and to use professionals and our legal team maybe in places where the Blight Review Board has gotten caught up a little bit in process. So we do want to take a holistic view of the Blight Review process. and make some recommendations potentially back to the RTM for some modifications to the ordinance. So that's just the backdrop for where we find ourselves today.
Okay, that's helpful. And then the additional capacity that's envisioned all here covers the blight work that they have in advance of this policy review.
Yes, and I guess I could share anecdotally here that there are some blight cases that there probably aren't enough hours in the day that you could throw at trying to adjudicate the case.
My garage
So-
or nothing? No, okay.
I don't think your garage is on the list,
Okay.
but nonetheless, we're mindful that this individual is sharing his time
Okay,
to these efforts, but we need to make sure that we're putting the tightest process in place so that we can use everyone's time in the best way and facilitate a more expedient outcome, if you will.
while we have you, just one other point that looked like there was some back and forth, and this was on the fire vehicle, excuse me, reserve contribution. I think it had been at $500,000, the replacement schedule that I saw, and I think Kate had come up with $530,000, and the Board of Selectmen dialed it back to a $500,000 contribution for this year. What's your thinking on that schedule, and how would you like
Sure.
to see that evolve?
So I think to date, we were just trying to keep up with sort of a designated amount of money that we would reserve over time. And I think that we should look at that reserve process in a more specific way in terms of when we're looking to replace or refurbish a vehicle and how much money we want to try and build up into the fund. I just think it needs to have a little bit more thoughtful policy put behind how much we recommend every year going into that reserve fund. I'm always mindful of not overtaxing our taxpayers at one point in time if those monies are not actually going to be expended for a significant period of time going forward. So yeah, I welcome continued discussions on that matter.
Okay. And then the only other last point that I think maybe is relevant for you is just the latest on this Opticom traffic system. I know you'd taken out $100,000 from that, and the idea there was that instead of spreading the $300,000 cost, we would just wait and have an appropriation for the entire project once they decide
Correct.
to go through with it?
Correct.
Okay, because then we can include that in bonding instead of reserving for it. I mean, that's what I would do, but is that the idea there?
Yes, I think there's desire on the part of the Board of Selectmen, and I might have heard concurrence from F&B that, rather than trying to reserve now for future projects, tax and spend for those projects at the time that the projects actually can be undertaken.
Okay.
There's certain things that we should be reserving for, but this didn't rise to that level for us.
Understood. Okay, thank you very much. The only other minor issues that I'd brought up was I'd noticed that the Deputy Fire Marshal has been the Emergency Management Director for several years, and what they had done was divided the cost between the Fire Marshal's office and EMS. Can you talk briefly about the...
Sure. So the deputy fire marshal for several years has been emergency management director. It's not routine day-to-day activity that he splits 50-50. But
This
they
is
have,
Mark, right? Or-
Yeah, this is Mark.
Okay.
But they have tracked his time over the last year or two and determined that he spends about 50% of his working hours on emergency management activities like training, revising policies, procedures, attending statewide emergency management meetings or dealing with actual emergencies, and about 50% of his time in the fire marshal's office on inspections and other fire marshal activities. So we just thought that the way that the emergency management budget has been presented in the past understates what we're spending and what that function actually costs us.
Okay.
So we chose to allocate his salary 50-50 based on his time.
I had a few other things that were all answered and just minor clarifying questions that I didn't get in some of the video presentations. But Paul, did you have any other questions that you wanted to bring up to this forum?
One about the radio maintenance and emergency management, it seemed to almost double, and
Yes.
I know they're,
So what you will notice is in the emergency management operating budget, their radio maintenance is up about 81%. It was up last year because the police department, when we renovated, their radios were, or their radio equipment. This isn't actual radios, this is kind of the network
Okay.
system. But the renovation covered the first few years of the operating expense on that. So that moved into emergency management in the current year. There's a slight increase. Along with that, we now have that, the decision was made at the time of the police renovation to tie our system into the state system. As such, we have a contractual requirement to keep the same software and hardware and have the same contractual agreement and requirements that the state has. The state has moved to a contract that includes not only software maintenance, but also hardware replacement in the annual amount. So that's where our big increase is coming from, is that now there's this other component in the annual contract. In theory, down the road, when hardware replacement is needed, we shouldn't see that as a standalone item because it should have been built up through this contractual change.
Should that amount change significantly next year? So, or
No,
on
it should
the
be
same-
stable now and just a normal annual increase from here forward.
Okay, and then on the capital, there was 500,000.
Yes, so this has been a lingering issue that Mark has been tracking. There's federal legislation that says we may, or unless it changes, we're gonna have to move off of our radio band. And with that is a significant cost. So he was, his request was an initial 500,000. His estimate of all of the equipment replacement that would be required to do that is about 6.5 million. He keeps a very close watch on what's going on with this. He is of the mind that it probably won't happen, but he wants to keep it on everybody's radar.
Okay, those are the only questions I had on those protective services. Thank you for that and for your responses today. The other topics on here were human services, excuse me, general overhead and miscellaneous expenses and other revenues. Did you have any comments or questions on it? I know Jim's not here tonight.
I think it's, I have a few comments on human services. I think other revenues, there's not much to say.
Okay.
And, but we can talk a little bit about human services. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge the range of services that are provided to the town of Darien by this department, from youth services straight through the senior center, and of course, some of the economic support programs that we provide.
It is remarkable, isn't it?
It is remarkable.
Yeah.
And they do a stupendous job. And when I look at the budget, I will say that the budget variance from last year to this is $48. So I commend them on that as well. Now there are a few shifts within the budgets, and there are a couple of things that I think should be watched. I don't know that we need to go through complete line item here. There's some changes in allocations and shared staff between departments, and some increases in temporary staff, in part-time staff that, you know, overall doesn't have a big budget impact. But there are a couple of things that jumped off the page to me that that are to watch. One is that new development, including the rebuild of the old town hall and new affordable housing, could increase the number of clients receiving services from this department, so that could have a budget impact going forward. The blight ordinance that we just talked about that went into effect, and all of the things that Jamie just talked about could require additional funding in future years. I think that there is some risk that potential state and local cuts to health and housing programs like Husky SNAP and the renter's rebate could drive up the demand for energy assistance, home goods closet, and other financial supports. It's something we should just be thinking about. I'm sure that Jamie and her team are thinking about. And then in senior transportation, this comes up every year in the budget discussion, but we do have the at-home Darien van, where the costs are paid by the town and then reimbursed by At-Home Darien, except for FICA, Medicare, liability, and auto insurance. And I think it was raised in the budget discussion process that this could potentially represent a liability to the town, and it's something that needs to be, you know, looked at. I don't know, Jamie, if you'd like to address that at all, but I think it is something that we should think about as a potential town liability.
Okay. Thank you for that. Any, no other questions for Diana on those topics? Okay. So the last budget item for us to discuss is fund balance. Jim Palin is responsible for that area, so he'll pick that up when we meet next. I don't expect that there's going to be any change in the budget for that, but to the extent he's got comments, particularly with regard to our policy that we put in place last year, why he can address that at that time. I guess I'd just close with a quick overview of where we stand. So Jen prepared an update of the budget model that we have been using and with the changes that we've been discussing. So this includes the $200,000 shift in debt service or
Yes.
reduction in debt service. This includes taking the selected capital projects that you and I discussed out
Right.
and reserve those for bonding. This includes the $569,000 in health insurance savings from the Board of Education and a few other here and there items, but nothing else
Couple of other
major.
smaller items.
So we started this process with a mill rate increase projected of 4.29%, and that's now down to just less than 3%. So as things stand right now, we would have a 2.92% increase in the mill rate from 16.08 to 16.55. So a modest increase and certainly a welcome one given what we were facing when we started this process. So not to say the Board of Finance did much, but we certainly took the input from others in terms of where things stand, input from other boards in terms of some of these changes, which led to a mill rate increase that's certainly high, but a lot less than it was when we started the process, which is terrific. This is absent anything that might come up from the interest income discussion, which we'll reserve for next week, but as it stands right now, a 2.92% increase. Did you have any other comments on the update to this analysis?
The only thing is I sent out a follow-up from our conversation last week on the tax collection. They
Yes.
raised some concern about kind of what was our historical low in case our current pleasant collections don't always continue that way.
Yeah.
So I think, I can't recall what the lowest was. It was several years ago, but you do have that historical information.
Yeah, and the reason that I was raising that, Jen, was just this notion of it's, and I don't know, but there, intuitively, you would think there's a correlation to the business cycle.
Right.
So with that last 10-year data, it's been a relatively upward swinging, positive number. What happens is there an inflection that may actually change that assumption? That's all I wanted to look at.
And that's something, we can keep all that historical data that we can look at it every year and say,
Yeah.
does our method of rolling 5-year average less 25
Yeah.
basis points, does that still make sense given what we know might be going on in the economy?
Right.
And then the second page of what I sent out includes just some year-to-date through February on the current collections and current levy.
After having looked at that, are you still recommending, at least at the moment, that we stick with the policy that we've had?
I do. I
Okay.
do recommend that.
All right, we ought to talk about it next week, but the great thing about that is you get some facts, we take a look at it, and then you can make a reasonable judgment that something needs to change or stay the same. Okay, that is all we had for our regular agenda. Does anyone?
John, a comment.
Please.
I'm not sure if this is late-breaking news. It's not late-breaking news, but it appears not that we dodged a bullet per se, but the state in its prudence is passing on the proposal on the teacher retirement. That seems to have not taken flight. I personally said before we began this year's discussion that I've always thought that was going to come back. I think it'll be back again. But for this year, it's not.
Well, the reports say it may reappear before the end, right?
Anything can happen. I think the governor's office has made a statement, though, so I think we can probably count on that. And they've got the votes. But anything can happen.
Right. Of course, that doesn't allay fears about a lot of other things they still have on the docket, from statewide car tax to 1% property tax to a variety of other things that I don't think have been fully decided. I mean, I forget who mentioned it. They have still a $2 billion budget deficit that they need to close, and that's still there. So more to come on that.
We have 2 meetings scheduled next week.
Yeah, that's the last thing I want to mention, which is just our meeting schedule. So we have a meeting set for 7:30 next Tuesday, and we're one set for next Thursday.
Okay.
So my sense is we don't need both of those meetings, but to free up Jen so that she can be prepared, what I'd like to propose is we cancel our meeting on Tuesday, and then we just go to Thursday, which will give you a chance to pull together everything for that meeting.
Good idea.
We'll have hopefully a version of this that can be final. We will definitely have an interest rate discussion or an interest income discussion next Thursday after we've had a chance to do some of this fact gathering. And the way the spreadsheet is set up is even if we do make that budget change, that's a quick thing that we can do to adjust the proposed mill rate on the fly. So not too late to have that discussion next week and still have a vote Thursday to set the mill rate. So unless you disagree, that's what I'd propose doing. So let's cancel next Tuesday's meeting, and then we're going to keep the Thursday meeting on the calendar at 7:30. So we will reconvene a week from today.
And there is a meeting on the schedule for the 16th.
Is there?
Is there not a meeting scheduled? Or is that the date that we by charter
That's-
must have?
yes, that's our
right. That's the
date
date.
by-
Must
that
the
we have to
second
turn it over
Tuesday
to
after the
the
third
town
Monday or
clerk.
whatever it is, but that's right.
After a full moon.
So we're,
Oh, that's Easter.
Yeah, so anyway, so we are canceling the meeting for Tuesday, April 9th, and keeping the meeting for Thursday, April 11th. Okay? All right, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Diana and the senator, thank you. All in favor? All right, we're adjourned.